change the educational landscape across the country. The president's speech comes hours after the Supreme Court ruled along ideological lines against affirmative action policies at Harvard and the University of North Carolina, overruling half a century of precedent. As we wait for the president, let's go straight to our chief White House correspondent, Kristen Welker. Kristen, obviously they've taken a bit of time here to digest what is in many ways a nuanced ruling.
Lester, that's right. This is a very nuanced, complicated ruling, and I am told that President Biden has been reviewing it with his staff throughout the morning. He convened a meeting with his senior staff so that he could make sure his response and his reaction to this ruling, which has in fact been viewed as a blow to affirmative action, although not necessarily overturning past precedent. One administration official familiar with the thinking inside the White House telling me into the run-up of today, quote, President Biden supports making an education beyond high school accessible to all Americans. As the Biden-Harris administration has reiterated in its brief in support of the universities, the federal government has an interest in ensuring that our colleges and universities are diverse. Here's the president.
Here is the president.
45 years, the United States Supreme Court has recognized the college's freedom to decide how to build diverse student bodies and to meet their responsibility of opening doors of opportunity for every single American. In case after case, including recently, just as a few years ago in 2016, the court has affirmed and reaffirmed this view, that colleges could use race not as a determinative factor for admission, but as one of the factors among many in deciding who to admit from a already qualified pool of applicants. Today, the court once again walked away from decades of precedent and as the dissent has made clear. The dissent states in today's decision, quote, rolls back decades of precedent and momentous progress, end of quote. I agree with that statement from the dissent. The court has effectively ended affirmative action in college admissions, and I strongly disagree with the court's decision. Because affirmative action is so misunderstood, I want to be clear, make sure everybody's clear about what the law has been and what it has not been until today. Many people wrongly believe that affirmative action allows unqualified students to be admitted ahead of qualified students. This is not how college admissions work. Rather, colleges set out standards for admission, and every student has to meet those standards. Then and only then, after first meeting the qualifications required by the school, do colleges look at other factors in addition to their grades, such as race. The way it works in practice is this. Colleges first establish a qualified pool of candidates based on meeting certain grade, test scores, and other criteria. Then and only then, it is from this pool of applicants, all of whom have already met the school standards, that the class is chosen after weighing a wide range of factors, among them being race. You know, I've always believed that one of the greatest strengths of America, you're tired of hearing me say it, is our diversity. But I believe that. If you have any doubt about this, just look at the United States military. The finest fighting force in the history of the world. It's been a model of diversity. And has not only made our nation better, stronger, but safer. I believe the same is true for our schools. I've always believed that the promise of America is big enough for everyone to succeed, and that every generation of Americans, we have benefited by opening the doors of opportunity just a little bit wider to include those who've been left behind. I believe our colleges are stronger when they're racially diverse. Our nation is stronger because we are tapping into the full range of talent in this nation. I also believe that while talent, creativity, and hard work are everywhere across this country, not equal opportunity. It is not everywhere across this country. We cannot let this decision be the last word. I want to emphasize, we cannot let this decision be the last word. While the court can render a decision, it cannot change what America stands for. America is an idea unique in the world, an idea of hope and opportunity, of possibilities, of giving everyone a fair shot, of leaving no one behind. We've never fully lived up to it, but we've never walked away from it either. We will not walk away from it now. We should never allow the country to walk away from the dream upon which it was founded. That opportunity is for everyone, not just a few. We need a new path forward, a path consistent with the law that protects diversity and expands opportunity. So today I want to offer some guidance to our nation's colleges as they review their admission systems after today's decision. Guidance that is consistent with today's decision. They should not abandon, let me say this again, they should not abandon their commitment to ensure student bodies of diverse backgrounds and experience that reflect all of America. What I propose for consideration is a new standard, where colleges take into account the adversity a student has overcome when selecting among qualified applicants. Let's be clear, under this new standard, just as was true under the earlier standard, students first have to be qualified applicants. They need the GPA and test scores to meet the school's standards. Once that test is met, then adversity should be considered, including students' lack of financial means, because we know too few students of low-income families, whether in big cities or rural communities, are getting an opportunity to go to college. When a poor kid, maybe the first in their family to go to college, gets the same grades and test scores as a wealthy kid, whose whole family's gone to the most elite colleges in the country and whose path has been a lot easier. Well, the kid who faced tougher challenges has demonstrated more grit, more determination, and that should be a factor that colleges should take into account in admissions, and many still do. It also means examining where the student grew up and went to high school. It means understanding the particular hardships that each individual student has faced in life, including racial discrimination that individuals have faced in their own lives. The court says, quote, "Nothing in this opinion should be construed as prohibiting universities from considering an application's discussion of how race has affected his or her life, but be it through discrimination or inspiration or otherwise," end of quote. Because the truth is, we all know it, discrimination still exists in America. Discrimination still exists in America. Discrimination still exists in America. Today's decision does not change that. It's a simple fact. If a student had to overcome adversity on their path to education, the college should recognize and value that. Our nation's colleges and universities should be engines of expanding opportunity through upward mobility. But today, too often, that's not the case. The statistics, one statistic, students from the top 1% of family incomes in America are 77 times more likely to get into elite college than one from the bottom 20% of family incomes. 77% greater opportunity. Today, for too many schools, the only people who benefit from the system are the wealthy and the well-connected. The odds have been stacked against working people for much too long. We need a higher education system that works for everyone, from Appalachia to Atlanta and to far beyond. We can and must do better, and we will. Today, I'm directing the Department of Education to analyze what practices help build a more inclusive and diverse student bodies and what practices hold that back. Practices like legacy admissions and other systems expand privilege instead of opportunity. Colleges and universities should continue their commitment to support, retain, and graduate diverse students and classes. You know, and companies who are already realizing the value of diversity should not use this decision as an excuse to turn away from diversity either. We can't go backwards. You know, I know today's court decision is a severe disappointment to so many people, including me, but we cannot let the decision be a permanent setback for the country. We need to keep an open door of opportunities. We need to remember that diversity is our strength. We have to find a way forward. We need to remember that the promise of America is big enough for everyone to succeed. You know, that's the work of my administration, and I'm always going to fight for that. And I want to thank you all. And I know you've been told I have a helicopter out there waiting to go up to do an interview in New York. I'll be talking more about this, a live interview. But thank you very much, and we're going to have plenty of time to talk about this. But we're not going to let this break us. Thank you.
President Biden, the Congressional Black Caucus said the Supreme Court has thrown into question its own legitimacy. Is this a rogue court?
This is not a normal court.
Should there be term limits for the justices, sir?
Okay, thank you, Paul.
President Biden taking no further questions after that about 10-minute long statement expressing his disappointment at the Supreme Court decision striking down race-based admissions at colleges, specifically involving cases at the University of North Carolina and Harvard. The president saying that it's important that colleges are able to take into account the adversity experienced by students. He said discrimination still exists in America and has charged the Department of Education to study this ruling a bit more. Also offering a bit of a roadmap to other schools as they reconsider their admissions policies. The president offering some advice on that in his remarks a moment ago. Let's bring back our chief White House correspondent, Kristen Welker. Kristen, this seems to be a decision in which the court gave some room for the president and others to find ways to try to achieve diversity at colleges.
Lester, absolutely. And you heard the president there stress the fact that the ruling does not rule out ways to make campuses and universities more diverse. But he is arguing that this is a step backwards, that it makes it more complicated. There was a bit of news there at the end when he was asked if this is a, quote, rogue court. He said, quote, this is not a normal court. One of the key things that stood out to me here, Lester, in terms of what we heard, goes back to something that you said. He has directed the Department of Education to analyze this and to try to find ways forward to foster diversity within universities. Students who have experienced adversity, students who live in different parts of the country, and yes, students who come from different racial and ethnic backgrounds. Why is this significant? This echoes, I think, a lot of what we heard from the president on the day that Roe v. Wade was overturned. A roadmap forward, action items that he plans to take, that he is calling his administration to take. And why is that significant? Because, of course, this is a president who is running for re-election, Lester. And what we are effectively seeing are the battle lines being drawn for 2024. This is the message that President Biden is going to take on the campaign trail. As he referenced, he's heading there to New York for a pair of fundraisers. He's also going to be doing an interview with our Nicole Wallace, where he will, of course, get questions about this and where we will hear more, not only about his message, but about the potential action items that he plans to take and that he plans to call on his administration to take moving forward. But again, Lester, I can't stress this enough. This is now a political issue front and center in the presidential election, Lester.
All right, Kristen, we'll ask you to stand by. Let me bring in our senior Washington correspondent, Hallie Jackson. Hallie, at the root of this really is how one views the need for affirmative action. The president making clear that there is still obviously a compelling need for diversity in colleges and to address racism in America. Looking at some of the comments of some of the Republican candidates for president, they seem to differ and suggest that we've moved on past the factors that resulted in affirmative action. Give us your thoughts.
That's right. So let's start with some of the reactions we're seeing from Republicans who are hoping to win back the White House from President Biden next November, starting with former President Donald Trump, who, as he notes, helped to install 3 of the more conservative justices onto this court. 3 of the justices who were a part of this decision that essentially eliminates some of the affirmative action process, as we've been talking about. Mr. Trump says this is a great day for America, calling this the ruling everyone was waiting for and hoping for. He says the result was amazing. You are largely hearing that positivity about today's decision echoed by other Republican candidates in this race, which brings us to the question, Lester, that you're getting at. Okay, so that's where the candidates stand. Where do the American people stand? What do people want when it comes to race and diversity on college campuses? It is a complicated question, Lester, and here's why. It depends on how you ask it. Right, so when you ask people, do they believe that race or ethnicity should be a factor specifically in the college admissions process? Generally, you see the answer being no, for example. When you ask about diversity, and you see this top poll number here, this is from a Reuters Ipsos poll this spring. If you ask about diversity on college campuses generally, you see these numbers. 58% of people say they agree with that yes, they would support diversity on college campuses. So it is this dichotomy, right? You see it in poll after poll. People say they want more diversity on college campuses, but more people say, a majority of Americans say, they don't want to see race as a factor in the college admissions process. This is what I think the country is grappling with to a degree when it comes to race and education. It is what the court has grappled with, and now it is what these schools at the center of this case are grappling with, too. We are hearing now from the two schools at the center of this, Harvard and the University of North Carolina, and I want to read you a bit about what we're hearing from each. Carolina says that they remain firmly committed to bringing together talented students with different perspectives and life experiences, and continues to make an affordable, high-quality education accessible to people in North Carolina. They say, while not the outcome we hoped for, we will carefully review the Supreme Court's decision and take any steps necessary to comply with the law. Harvard says in the weeks and months ahead, drawing on the talent and expertise of our community, we will determine how to preserve, consistent with the court's new precedent, our essential values, going on to say that Harvard will continue to be a vibrant community whose members come from all walks of life all over the world. Put more simply, Lester, if I may paraphrase sort of both of these statements in one, they're going to take a beat and figure out how they're going to move forward with ensuring that their campuses are diverse and more diverse without violating what the Supreme Court has just laid out. I don't think these schools, or frankly many schools, have an understanding yet of how they can do that given the confines of what the court has decreed here. But it is going to be a process that we will see in admissions offices, in dean's offices across the country over the course of the next several months, Lester.
All right, Hallie, thanks. Let me bring in our senior legal correspondent, Laura Jarrett. Laura, if I can direct you back to those poll numbers that Hallie showed a moment ago, showing some disconnect between how people, depending on how the question is asked, how the American public perceives affirmative action. The president seemed to be picking up on that when he talked about what these mean, the pool of qualified candidates before you even get to the question of race. Did he get that correct?
It's interesting. I noticed that as well, Lester, trying to almost preempt arguments against affirmative action, almost giving everyone a real-time fact check there about how colleges are going about their work. And they would tell you he is correct. They look at it in a holistic, non-formulaic, individualized way. The problem for them is that this Supreme Court didn't buy it, at least when it came to Harvard and UNC's programs. And so many schools, at least the top elite colleges that we're talking about, are basing their programs on the same type of programs that this court has now struck down. And so that's what I think has left everyone sort of saying, well, what's left at this point? And then again, you hear the president today zero in on the exact same set of paragraphs that are buried at the end of the Chief Justice's opinion, something that Harvard has picked up on well, saying essentially, if you want to write an essay about how race has impacted your life as an individual, not in some broad, holistic manner, but as you as an individual and how you've persevered through something, that is okay. They've left the wiggle room there, and a lot of effort and ink, I imagine, in the coming years is going to be spilled on dissecting that very set of paragraphs that the president has also honed in on, Lester. Yeah,
and that's going to be, as we said, these colleges are going to be studying this opinion right now, but that would allow them a window, or I guess an open door to really perceive what these, let's talk about the essay might say or the point of it.
And they would say they're already doing this. The colleges would say this is not a check the box for one race and you get in type of exercise. The same, again, type of argument that the president you just heard pushing back on there. They would say it's never the case that somebody gets in on the basis of their race alone. But the trials in this case for Harvard and UNC did show that for a small number of people, race is outcome determinative. In other words, it does add a bump that gets somebody over the finish line in a small number of cases. And for those cases, that's where it seems that the rubber is going to meet the road on future litigation with this conservative court, Lester. And
then I also want to get you to comment on the notion of what this means for the future of other affirmative action efforts in other parts of society in American life.
Well, that's an interesting one. They have a carve out here for the military, the court specifically saying we're not addressing that. There are a unique set of circumstances when it comes to the military that wasn't presented here on the record they have before them for this college and university. So we're not touching that. But you can imagine that's one of the issues that's going to come up next. And then I should mention the advocate that brought this case against Harvard and UNC has other cases in the pipeline, specifically about diversity programs for internships at corporations. And so you can see sort of how this is going to slowly sort of bleed into those next steps when it comes from not just about education, but also about the workplace and diversity inclusion programs.
Okay, Laura, we'll ask you to stand by. Let me bring back our chief White House correspondent, Kristen Welker. As we discussed at the top of this is now a political issue, a major political issue. You're hearing from some Democrats now. What kind of reactions are you getting?
Including from former President Obama, Lester, who had lunch with President Biden earlier this week. Let me read you what he says. He says, quote, like any policy, affirmative action wasn't perfect, but it allowed generations of students like Michelle and me to prove we belonged. Now it's up to all of us to give young people the opportunities they deserve and help students everywhere benefit from new perspectives. This was Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer. Lester, let me read you a little bit of his statement. He says, quote, the Supreme Court ruling has put a giant roadblock in our country's march toward racial justice. Senator Cory Booker, the Supreme Court's decision to strike down affirmative action is a devastating blow to our education system across the country. So that is the type of language that you are hearing from Democrats as they take a beat and try to determine exactly what this is going to look like, I think, from a practical standpoint, but also from a political standpoint. And again, I go back to Roe v. Wade being overturned. That was obviously a critical issue in the midterm elections, widely credited with mobilizing Democratic voters. President Biden laying that stake in the ground, saying that there need to be action items that come from this. And I wouldn't be surprised if that's a message that he and other top Democrats reiterate as they head into this next election cycle. And the challenge is going to be, I think, on the campaign trail, how to really harness that momentum that we saw from voters in the midterm election cycles. And you're going to see that on both sides, quite frankly, Lester. So again, I think that this is going to be a critical issue on the campaign trail. We know that voters of color, African-American voters, were critical to President Biden winning the White House in 2020. We also know that support has waned a bit, with some of those voters saying that he hasn't done enough, for example, on the economy. And so is this a moment, is this an issue where he can harness some of that momentum? And broadly speaking, we have heard from the vice president, from other top administration officials, some really strong language when it comes to the Supreme Court. We've heard the vice president call the Supreme Court an extremist court. And now today, again, President Biden was asked about this court, and he said this is not a normal court when he was asked if this is a rogue court. That's the type of language, those are the type of rallying cries I think you're going to hear from Democrats as they head into this next election cycle.
All right, and Hallie, let me turn to you on that same point of what the president said about this not a normal court. Keep in mind, he said that after a pretty lengthy pause there, as if he was giving serious thought to how he wanted to phrase this. But what does that tell you as we go forward?
Well, you're so right, Lester. It was almost a throwaway at the end as he was responding to one of the questions that one of the reporters in the room was shouting. And you could tell he was perhaps weighing. Does he answer it? Does he not? We know he's going to be speaking later on this afternoon with our own Nicole Wallace. Is so interesting. And I think, as Kristen says, a rallying cry perhaps for Democrats, but also for conservatives. We haven't seen any reaction to that specific line, that this is not a normal court just yet, from those on the GOP side. But if I had to predict, I can imagine that you will hear a lot of pushback to that idea, because former President Trump, former Vice President Mike Pence are already out today pointing to the fact that it was their administration that put three of these more conservative justices on the court in the first place, tilting in many ways the balance of power on the court when it relates to the political spectrum here. That is significant, Lester. And I will tell you that for Republican voters, Republican primary voters, having been out on the campaign trail quite a bit over this last decade, the court is often a mobilizing factor for them. It was prior to the Trump administration. People, when you would go out and talk to folks in Iowa or New Hampshire, they wanted to see conservatives on the court. Donald Trump delivered that to them. And so this issue of the court is motivating. You look, though, at the way people feel about the Supreme Court. Take a look at some of our numbers from NBC News. Only 31% of Americans say that they have a positive view of the court. You see it there. That bottom number, that is the lowest number that we have ever recorded in our NBC News poll about the court. This is reflected in other polls, too. When did it change? It was after the leak of the Dobbs decision, the decision by the Supreme Court that ultimately overturned that landmark reproductive rights decision, Roe versus Wade. That is when you saw a big erosion in people's faith in the court. It is mostly leveled off since then, but it does speak to the way that Americans are tuned in to what the court is doing and the way that there is a political context and a political backdrop to these court decisions that is going to have an impact come 2024, Lester.
All right, Hallie, thanks. And that concludes this NBC News special report. We'll have more coverage on our streaming network, NBC News Now, and tonight on NBC Nightly News. I'm Lester Holt. I'll see you then.